Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? I am coming at you guys with another tier list video. It's been a while since I made one of these videos, but still it's something that I want to do for you guys. And in today's video, I'm going to be doing a tier list of Ninjago villains. Now this was a video that I made a while back, however it has been a while since the last time I made that video, and my opinions on some villains have changed, plus we've also gotten a bunch of new villains added to the franchise. And so in today's video, I'm going to be ranking a bunch of them for you guys. So let's get into this whole thing. So starting off, we have Samukai, and I'm going to put him in B tier. Samukai was the first ever major antagonist that we got when it came to the show, and overall I think he was pretty solid. I think he was decently threatening for a villain. I think his dynamic with Garmadon throughout the events of the pilot season was handled pretty solidly. I think it's interesting he was basically the only serious member of the Skulkin Warriors in comparison to everyone else who was more comedic, and he was Ninjago's first ever four-armed antagonist, which is definitely something, and overall when it comes to Samukai again, I think he's pretty solid all things considered. After this, we have Garmadon, who is, of course, going in S tier. Garmadon is, without question, one of the best villains and characters in all of Ninjago. He is such a legitimately interesting and compelling character when it comes to the franchise, with a genuinely amazing story that we've seen play out throughout the events of the show, with Garmadon being corrupted and becoming a bad guy, but him fighting against that and wanting to be a good person for that to ultimately happen during the events of seasons 3 and 4, only for him to eventually become a villain again during the Oni trilogy, only for him to eventually overcome that and work to try and redeem himself during Crystallize. It's something that I think is legitimately really interesting to see, and seeing all the growth and change that Garmadon has gone through over the events of the show I think is genuinely fantastic, and his dynamic with Lloyd for the most part I think is legitimately really good, with Crystallize really being the only exception. And overall when it comes to Garmadon again, I think that he is without question one of the best villains and characters in all Ninjago. After this, we have Pythor, who I am going to be putting in A tier. What is there to say about Pythor that hasn't already been said by so many other people? Pythor is just an absolutely fantastic character when it comes to the show. He is such an entertaining villain with so many genuinely hilarious moments all throughout the events of the show. I think he's fantastic. I like the idea of Pythor being this reoccurring character who we constantly see showing up over and over again, essentially being this thorn in the ninja side that they can't really get rid of. I think that's great. I think it's interesting also seeing how Pythor has somewhat changed over the years, particularly when it comes to the various ways he's tried to take over Ninjago, and I really like what they did with him during Season 4, giving him this sense of honor and seeing him actually work alongside the ninja in order to defeat Chen, but even then he only did that just so he can try and take over Ninjago later, which definitely fits with Pythor. And again, overall, I think Pythor is really great, and again, he is such an entertaining character. After this, we have Kozu, who I'm going to put in D tier. Honestly, I just don't really have that much to say about Kozu. Overall, I think he's pretty boring and not that interesting. He has a kind of cool design, and it's neat that he has 4 arms, but that's about it. That's really all I have to say about the guy. Overall, I just think he's just, again, pretty boring, all things considered. After this, we have the Overlord, and I'm actually going to put the Overlord in S tier. To be completely and totally 100% honest with you guys, I actually really like the Overlord, and I think he's a lot better than people give him credit for. I think the role that he plays when it comes to Ninjago's history is legitimately really interesting. I like his rivalry with the first Ninjutsu Master and his family. I think it's something really interesting. I like the idea of the Overlord being this eternal force of darkness when it comes to Ninjago who can never be truly defeated, thus allowing for there to always be a balance of good and evil. I think that's interesting. I think he's able to work fairly well as this overall main antagonist when it comes to the Ninjago franchise, and his dynamics that he has with the other villains throughout the show, especially Garmadon during Season 2, I think are honestly really good. And overall, when it comes to the Overlord, again, I honestly really like him, and again, I think he's honestly a lot better than people give him credit for. After this, we have Cryptor, and I'm going to put him in A tier. Cryptor, just like Pythor, I think, is another really entertaining character when it comes to the show, with him having a lot of genuinely really comedic moments all throughout the events of Season 3. I think is something that's honestly great. I like the idea of Cryptor essentially being this anti-Zane, with the two of them being polar opposites of one another. I think that's interesting. And his rivalry with Mindroid throughout the events of the season, I thought that was absolutely hilarious, and it's a big reason why I think Cryptor is such an entertaining character. And yeah, again, I just really like Cryptor. After this, we have Chen, who I'm going to be putting in A tier. Once again, we have yet another really entertaining character when it comes to the show, because Chen is absolutely hilarious. Chen has so many genuinely funny moments all throughout the events of the show, and he's able to bring a lot of laughs whenever he shows up. I think it's great. I also think that when it comes to Chen, he's able to work fairly well as a serious antagonist when the time calls for it, like towards the end of season 4, with him using Skylar in order to go through with the Anachondrai spell, thus allowing for him and all his followers to become Anachondrai, with them actually being able to take over half of Ninjago. I think that's something that was handled well. There's also the big role that Chen played in the lore of Ninjago, with him being the one responsible for the first Serpentine War starting, and him starting another one during the events of season 4. There's also the fact that he had a big role to play in Garmadon and Misako getting together, and when it comes to Chen, again, he played a pretty big role when it came to Ninjago's history, and again, when it comes to Chen, I think he's really, really great. He can be serious when the time calls for it, but again, he's just absolutely hilarious. After this, we then have Klaus, who I'm also going to put in A tier. Honestly, Klaus is another character who I do legitimately really like. I think there are some things about him that are handled pretty well, such as his rivalry with Garmadon that we see throughout the events of Season 4. I think that is something that's honestly handled fairly well, and the big reason why I'm putting Klaus in A tier is primarily with him being this reoccurring antagonist that we saw following the events of Season 4, with him briefly showing up during Seasons 5 and 6, as well as him being the main antagonist of the Dark Island trilogy. That's something that I did think was honestly interesting, and I think it's cool seeing Klaus, who at the time was a minor antagonist, having a somewhat larger role going forward when it came to the franchise. I think that's actually pretty cool. And so when it comes to Klaus, again, I'm putting him up in A tier. After this, we have Moro, who is going right at the very top of S tier. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but Moro is my favorite Ninjago villain of all time. I think that he is such a legitimately really great and interesting character when it comes to the show. I mean, I did make that really long video talking about him before Season 3 Part 1 came out. So, for a quick recap when it comes to all that stuff, I really like Moro's backstory. I think it works really well, making him the sympathetic antagonist when it comes to the show, and I think his dynamic with Wu is handled really well. I really like the dynamic that we get between him, Lloyd, and Kai, with all three of their characters relating into the stuff when it comes to the Green Ninja. I think that's really interesting. I think seeing Moro dealing with his ego and his superiority and inferiority complex that he has throughout the events of Season 5 was something legitimately really great to see. I also like the idea that when it comes to Moro, he was trying to make his own destiny and fight back against it, something that he was ultimately able to do during the events of the season. I thought that was great. Moro, I think, is also a really entertaining character, like some of the other characters that I brought up so far. I really liked his redemption at the end of Season 5 and Day of the Departed. I thought it was handled really well, and I really like what Season 3 Part 1 did with him, turning him into the protector of the spectral lands and guiding lost souls and helping them move on. I think that's something that works really, really well for Moro, and overall, again, I just really like Moro, and he is my favorite Ninjago villain of all time. I think he's fantastic. After this, we then have Gultar, and I'm gonna put him in F tier. Honestly, I am not a fan of Gultar, primarily because I just think he's honestly pretty annoying, all things considered. I really don't think Gultar is all that funny. None of his moments, I think, really come off as that comedic, and overall, again, I just really don't like him that much. After this, we then have Bansha and Soul Archer, and I'm going to put the two of them both in C tier. The two of them are both alright, I think. I think the two of them are better than Gultar, but the two of them I don't think have anything that particularly interesting about either one of them, except for Soul Archer, where Ronin owes him a debt. That is something that's a bit interesting, but even then we don't really learn that much about it. But when it comes to these two, like, they're alright, I think, when it comes to the show, but I just don't really have that much to say about either one of them. After this, we then have Nanakon, who I am going to be putting in A tier. Nanakon is another villain who I really, really like. Once again, when it comes to Nanakon, I think he's another pretty entertaining antagonist when it comes to the show, having some pretty comedic moments throughout the events of Season 6. I think that was great. I really like Nanakon's dynamic with Jay throughout the events of the season, and seeing the two of them being polar opposites of one another, I thought that was something really interesting to see. And I like the idea that when it comes to Nanakon, something that we see with him throughout the events of Skybound is him manipulating the ninja into using their wishes, so that way they can wish it all away and be trapped inside the Sword of Souls, because it's part of the whole thing of Nanakon wanting to get revenge on the ninja for the destruction of the Curse Realm, which led to the destruction of Ninjago. And as he said during the season, actions have consequences, and that's the entire idea with Nanakon manipulating the ninja. I think it's honestly something really great to see. And overall, when it comes to Nanakon, again, I really liked him during the events of Skybound. After this, we then have the Mechanic, who I'm also going to be putting in A tier. The mechanic is another character who I honestly think is really good. Pretty similar to Pythor and Klaus. I like the idea of the mechanic being this reoccurring antagonist who we see showing up a lot when it comes to the show, with him constantly fighting against the ninja on numerous occasions. I think that's something honestly pretty great to see. The mechanic is yet another really entertaining character when it comes to the show, with him having so many comedic moments. And in case it isn't obvious, I honestly really like a lot of the more comedic villains when it comes to the show. I think they're great. I think it's interesting seeing the mechanic take on a primary antagonist role during the events of season 12 and Crystallize. I think both those seasons do a good job at showing us how much the mechanic has been able to grow over the events of the show, especially since when it comes to the mechanic, he didn't start off the show being in some kind of position of power or anything. He had to legitimately work in order to get into the position that he's in, and that's one big thing about the mechanic that I think is really cool. He connects right into a big thing that we see with Ninjago, which is that you don't need powers in order to achieve great things, but the mechanic does that for the villains. I think that is honestly something pretty cool, and overall I think that the mechanic is honestly a pretty underrated antagonist when it comes to the show. After this, we then have Yang, who I'm actually going to put in B tier. I think that Yang is honestly a pretty underrated antagonist when it comes to the show. I like the idea that he was set up in season 5 before he actually became the main antagonist during Day of the Departed. I think his backstory that we learned during DOTD is honestly pretty interesting, and I like the idea that when it comes to Yang, he's not a full-blown antagonist when it comes to the show, and his main overall goal is that he wanted to be remembered, and he didn't want to be forgotten. I think that is something legitimately really interesting, and it sets the Yang apart from the other villains that we've seen when it comes to the show, and it makes him a lot more human in my opinion, which I do think is pretty cool. And I also like that he was able to redeem himself at the end of Day of the Departed by helping Cole going through the rift, allowing him to become human again. I think that was honestly something great to see. After this, we then have Acronix and Crux, and I'm putting both of them in C tier. Acronix and Crux, I think, are both fine when it comes to the show. I don't really have any major thoughts on them one way or another when it comes to the franchise. Like, the two of them overall, again, I think they're fine antagonists. They work well as bad guys during the events of Season 7, and they get the job done. I don't have that much to say about either one of them. There are a couple things about them that I liked, like the similarities and parallels that we see between the two of them and Kai and Nia during Season 7. That's kind of cool. And I do like the idea of them being these elemental masters that turn against the Elemental Alliance. I think that's a fairly interesting concept for their villain origins. But again, overall, I just don't have that much to say about them. And again, I think the two of them are just fine, to be honest. After this, we then have Harumi, who I am putting at the bottom of F tier. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but I don't like Harumi. She is by far my least favorite villain and character when it comes to Ninjago. I am just not a fan of her at all. Her backstory, and more specifically her hatred of the ninja, doesn't really make a lot of sense when you look at it. We're given a pretty weak explanation behind why she decides to kill the Emperor and Empress. She has some pretty hypocritical views on the ninja when you look at it. Her words and actions completely contradict each other, with her saying how she wants to protect Ninjago and restore it to glory, but she does the exact opposite throughout the events of the show. Her relationship with Lloyd isn't really a relationship. It's more so a cycle of constant toxicity and abuse, with Harumi doing a bunch of really bad stuff to Lloyd, and I honestly think it's something that gets hard to watch after a while when it comes to the show. Harumi being adopted and becoming Garmadon's daughter, I'd argue, really doesn't go anywhere that significant when it comes to Season 9, and I think it's honestly kind of strange that Lloyd never found out about that during the season. Harumi's death scene at the end of Season 9 is a scene that honestly I really don't like, and I honestly think it's the worst scene in all Ninjago, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense for Harumi's character. And then there's literally everything that we got with her during the events of Crystallize, such as her resurrection, her working alongside the Overlord, her really confusing dynamic with Lloyd all throughout the events of the season. The show essentially trying to force the idea of a relationship between her and Lloyd, and then there's her redemption at the end of the season, which isn't really a redemption. It's just her blaming someone else for her problems, then her acting like she never did anything wrong. Overall, when it comes to Harumi, again, I really don't like her, and again, she is by far my least favorite character when it comes to Ninjago. I do not like her at all. After this, we then have Iron Baron, who I am going to be putting in C tier. Just like Acronix and Crux, I think that Iron Baron overall is fine when it comes to the show. I don't have any major thoughts on him one way or another. There are a couple things about him that I do think are interesting, such as the few bits of backstory that we get with him and his past with Firstborn. It's something. As well as his rivalry with Wu that we see towards the end of the season, it's something I just wished it was a bit fleshed out more during the events of the season. But overall, when it comes to Iron Baron, I just don't really have that much to say about him, all things considered. Again, overall, I think he's fine. I just wish there were some more things about him. And to be completely honest, I do think that some of the ideas that we got with him would end up working better with other villains that we would get later on down the line, like Vex and Beatrix. After this, we then have the Omega, who I'm going to be putting in F tier. In my opinion, the Omega is the most boring and basic character in all of Ninjago. His entire character is just, I want to conquer Ninjago, and that's pretty much it. That's really all there is to his character, and not much else. We don't really learn that much about the Omega during the events of Season 10, and what his motive is, and what his overall goal is, besides just conquering the various realms. And the few bits of information we do learn about him can also be applied to the rest of the Oni as well, not him specifically. His rivalry with Garmadon, I think, was an interesting idea, and I can see where the show was going with it, but these two don't really interact that much during the events of the season, and the few interactions that we do get with them, I'd argue, really aren't that good. And when it comes to the Omega, he honestly just feels like the Overlord all over again because there's a lot of similarities between the two of them. But I'd argue that when it comes to the Overlord, there are some legitimately interesting and compelling things about him. Meanwhile, for the Omega, that isn't really the case. And so overall, when it comes to the Omega, I really don't like him. After this, we then have Asphira, who I'm actually going to be putting in B tier. I made a video talking about Asphira a while back, but I honestly think that she is the most overhated villain in all of Ninjago. I honestly think she's a lot better than people give her credit for. I think that her backstory and history with Wu is something that's fairly interesting when it comes to the season. I think the whole idea of her wanting revenge, while it can get annoying at times, I feel like you can definitely see where she's coming from during the events of the season. I think she's able to pose a decent challenge for the ninja during the fire chapter, as well as showing us the position that the ninja are in after being lazy for so long. As I pointed out during my video talking about Asphira, she essentially wins at the end of the fire chapter by banishing Zane to the Netherrealm, thus causing Wu to suffer a lot as a result of it, so that's something that I think is cool. And I honestly liked her return during the events to Crystallize. I honestly think that she was a pretty entertaining antagonist, and her dynamic with Vangelis I thought was honestly handled really well. And again, when it comes to Asphira, I honestly think that she's the most overhated villain in all of Ninjago, and again, I think she's honestly better than people give her credit for. After this, we then have the Ice Emperor, who I am going to be putting in A tier. I really like the Ice Emperor. I think he's honestly handled really well during the events of the Ice chapter. For one, we don't see him that much for most of the Ice chapter, which I think does a good job of building him up as being this really mysterious antagonist when it comes to the show. I also think it's interesting to see. I also like how he ends up tying into Lloyd's story during the events of the season of him learning how to put his trust in others, with Lloyd putting his trust into the Ice Emperor in order to try and get Zane back to the way he was, which does ultimately work during the final episode of the season. Also, the Ice Emperor being Zane is something that I think is handled really well, and it connects really well into Zane's character and his humanity, with Vex erasing Zane's memories and turning Zane into the exact opposite of himself, completely taking away his humanity, but Zane is ultimately able to regain his humanity at the end of the season, showing that it's something that can never be truly taken away from him. I think it's something that's honestly handled really well. And overall, when it comes to the Ice Emperor, I think that he is honestly a really great villain when it comes to the show. After this, we have Vex, and I am going to be putting him in S tier. Vex is definitely my favorite Wild Brain antagonist that we got, as well as my favorite post-movie villain that we have gotten. Vex, I think, is honestly really good. For one, there's his backstory with him initially being from the Formling village, but because he wasn't able to unlock his animal form, that results in him becoming really paranoid, eventually going into self-exile, which is something that I think is really interesting. Like I said, he has a massive role to play when it comes to turning Zane into the Ice Emperor, making him the true main antagonist of the Ice chapter, which is a twist that I think is honestly handled really well during the events of the Ice chapter. I think Vex serves really well as a dark parallel to Lloyd and Nikita, showing a possible future for the two of them. If the two of them still had their trust issues and anxiety, I think that was handled really well. I like that when it comes to Vex, he was basically responsible for his own defeat by saying the word protect, which caused Zane to remember everything after Lloyd put his trust into him. I think that was handled really well. And I like that when it comes to Vex's defeat, it brings his story full circle, with him going back in exile, the thing that he hated the most, but this time he doesn't have the support of the Formlings, and initially Vex went into exile because he thought that everyone hated him, but now he's going into exile because everyone does hate him. I think that's honestly handled really well. And overall, when it comes to Vex, again, he is definitely my favorite Wild Brain antagonist and post-movie villain that we've gotten. After this, we then have Unagami, and I'm going to put him in A tier. Unagami is another villain who I made a video talking about, and when it comes to Unagami, I think he's honestly the most unique Ninjago villain that we've ever gotten when it comes to the show. I think Unagami is honestly really interesting. For one, there's a dynamic that we see between him and Milton Dyer, with the two of them having this father and son dynamic throughout the events of the season. I think it's honestly something pretty interesting and definitely unique compared to what we usually see when it comes to Ninjago villains. I also think that the two of them both tie really well into Prime Empire's overall themes and messages about artificial intelligence and their creators. I think that's something really interesting. There's also Unagami's dynamic with Okino continuing on with the whole father and son thing that we saw with him and Milton Dyer. I thought that was great. I like that when it comes to Unagami, he's essentially meant to be this dark parallel to Jay, showing what could have happened to Jay if he never came to terms with him being abandoned by his parents. I think that's interesting. And I like that when it comes to Unagami, he isn't a full-blown antagonist because he's doing everything that he's doing because he just wants to know why he was made in the first place and he just wants answers. It's something that I think is honestly interesting and sets him apart from the other antagonists. And again, it's something that I do honestly like. After this, we then have the Skull Sorcerer, and I'm also going to be putting him in A tier. Vangelis is another villain who I honestly think is really great when it comes to the show. For one, I think the twist of Vangelis being the Skull Sorcerer is something that's handled fairly well during the events of Season 13. I think that the dynamic that we see between him and the Skull of Hazador throughout the events of the season is something pretty good, and it can lead to some fairly comedic moments when it comes to the show. His dynamic with Cole, I think, is really great, as Vangelis is meant to represent everything that Cole's been fighting against after he made that promise to his mom, so that's something that I think is handled really well. And a big thing about Vangelis that I honestly really like is that he's basically Ninjago's most realistic villain when you look at it, because the entire idea behind Vangelis is that he's a businessman and he's doing everything that he's doing in order to make money, but he doesn't care about any of the bad stuff that he's doing. The only thing that he cares about is that he's making the money. And again, I'd argue that because of that, it makes him Ninjago's most realistic villain. And it's something that I do think is interesting to see. After this, we then have Chief Mamatus, and I'm going to be putting him in B tier. Chief Mamatus and the Keepers overall, I think, are fairly underrated when it comes to the show. We don't see that much of them during the events of the show, but the few things we do get with them are pretty good. I think the idea of them being set up as antagonists only for it to be revealed that they aren't actually bad guys is something that I think is something that's handled well during the events of the island. I also like the idea of them being tasked to protect the Storm Amulet by the first Spinjitzu Master himself. I think that's something interesting. And I like the idea that when it comes to the Keepers, they were the ones who ended up getting tricked instead of the ninjas being the one getting tricked by something. Usually we end up seeing the opposite of that during Ninjago season, so I think it's interesting to see it this time around. And again, when it comes to Chief Mamatus and the Keepers, I think they're honestly pretty underrated when it comes to the show. After this, we then have Calamar, who I'm going to be putting in S tier. Calamar is another villain who I honestly really like when it comes to the show. For one, there's the whole ruthlessness and brutality that we see with him throughout the events of Seabound, with him doing whatever he can in order to try and reawaken Gojira. I think that's something interesting to see. We also get a lot of pretty entertaining moments with him throughout the events of the season, and I do think that Calamar can definitely be a funny antagonist when the time calls for it during the season. That's great. His dynamics with characters like Nia and Benthamar, I think, are handled really well throughout the events of the season, and Calamar in general, I think, is just honestly a really great character when it comes to the show. After this, we then have Mr. F, and I am going to be putting him in C tier. Mr. F is another character who I think is just fine when it comes to the show. Once again, I don't have that much to say about him. And we don't really get that much from him during the events of Crystallize, so again, I just don't have that much to say about him. And overall, I think he is alright. That being said, though, him being named Mr. F does ruin the whole naming thing they did with Mr. E, so that's something that I don't like. And I do think it is kind of weird that he was the only new villain that we got on the Council of the Crystal King, while all the other villains were all returning antagonists. So again, I do think it is weird that we got a brand new one, with said new villain being just an upgraded version of Mr. E. Again, I do think that is a little strange, but overall, when it comes to Mr. F, again, I think he's just fine, to be honest. After this, we then have the Bone King, and I'm going to put him in D tier. When it comes to the Bone King, there really isn't that much to say about him, I'd argue. He only showed up in one episode of Dragon's Rising, and that was it, and he had a pretty minor role in his only appearance, which I will admit is kind of strange, to be completely honest. When it comes to the Bone King, I think it's interesting that he serves as a major antagonist when it comes to the core sets. I think that's something that's kind of cool, and just like with Kozu, I think he does have a kind of cool design, but overall, that's really all I have to say when it comes to this guy, because there just really isn't that much to say, I'd argue. After this, we then have Beatrix, and I'm gonna put Beatrix in B tier. When it comes to Beatrix, she's alright when it comes to Dragon's Rising. I will admit, I do think that for a majority of the season, she isn't that interesting until the final few episodes where we see her becoming a lot more crazy, which I do think was able to add on to her character, and it made her a bit more interesting, all things considered. Though there are some other things about her before that were interesting, such as her being in complete and total control over Imperium, and like I said, there are some ideas that we saw with Iron Baron that I think do work a bit better with Beatrix, particularly, again, when it comes to her being in complete control of Imperium, so there's that. There's also the role that she and Roz played in actually taking over Imperium, which is definitely a big deal. And again, when it comes to her becoming a lot more crazy towards the end of the season, I think that did result in her becoming a somewhat more interesting character. But for the most part, when it comes to Beatrix, again, I think she's just fine when it comes to the season, but there are some things about her that I do honestly like. After this, we then have Jordana, who I'm going to be putting in A tier. Jordana is a character who I honestly think is pretty good when it comes to Dragon's Rising. I like the idea that she played a more minor role throughout the events of Season 1, but that season still did a lot to set her up to be a bigger antagonist during Season 2. I thought that was handled pretty well. Her rivalry with Sora, I think, is alright, but it's something that I think is definitely more interesting when it comes to stuff with Jordana specifically and things with her character, so there's that. I like the idea that throughout the first half of Season 2, even though we saw Jordana being a bad guy, it was pretty obvious that she wasn't fully on board with what Roz was doing, showing that when it came to Jordana, she wasn't fully on the side of being evil, something that we can see even more of during the second half of the season, with Jordana doing what she can in order to fight back against Rox's possession and turning to Sora for help because she knows Sora's the only person who could actually listen to her and be willing to help her out. And I like that when it comes to Jordana at the end of Season 2, it's left a bit up in the air as to what exactly happened to her, meaning it's possible that we could see her getting some kind of redemption at some point in the future. Personally, I think that would be pretty cool, actually. After this, we then have Roz, who I am putting at the very top of A tier. Out of all the new villains that we've gotten, and really out of all the new characters that we've gotten in Dragon's Rising, Roz would definitely have to be my favorite. I think that he is a legitimately really great villain when it comes to the show. I like the idea of him being this manipulator and him doing whatever he can in order to get people to do what he wants. I think that's something really interesting to see. Like I said earlier, there's the big role that he had to play when it came to Beatrix taking over Imperium, and when it came to that, Roz was doing all that just to serve the goal of his master, which I think is interesting. And I think the whole mystery surrounding Roz's master and what they want to do is something that's really interesting, especially since when it comes to that mystery, it's something that's constantly being built up throughout the events of Dragon's Rising. It's something that I do think is honestly pretty cool to see, actually. I also like the idea of Roz being a teacher, and it shows us some interesting parallels between him and Lloyd, showing the various ways that the two of them differ when it comes to their teaching methods. There's also Roz being absolutely brutal and ruthless all throughout the events of the show, showing that he's willing to do whatever he can in order to achieve the goals of his master and his own personal goals. I think that is honestly pretty interesting. And overall, when it comes to Roz, again, he is definitely my favorite new character that we've gotten when it comes to Dragon's Rising. And now we go from my favorite Dragon's Rising villain to my least favorite, because now we have Cinder, and I am putting him in F tier. It's no secret on my channel that I don't like Cinder, and I'm not really a fan of him. For one, I think that Cinder overall isn't that interesting of a character, honestly. I think for the most part, he's pretty boring, honestly. And I think that when it comes to the moments that are meant to be more entertaining or funny with him, I think they come off as either more annoying or boring, all things considered. Cinder, by and large, felt like a pretty underdeveloped character during the events of Season 2, because his dynamics with the other characters I didn't think were that particularly interesting, and we learned barely anything about him throughout the events of the season. We never learn his backstory, we don't learn why he and Roz are working together, we don't know why Cinder is a villain, we learn none of those things throughout the events of the season. Okay, so again, Cinder largely came off as feeling like an underdeveloped character throughout the events of the season, and as I've stated on multiple occasions, my biggest problem when it comes to Cinder is that he's a permanent reminder of the show killing off an older character just to introduce their replacement, because I really don't like that when it came to Cinder, the show ended up killing off Ash off screen just to introduce Cinder as the new Elemental Master of Smoke. That is something that I honestly really don't like, and I honestly think it would have been a bit more interesting if the show had brought Ash back and potentially expanded on his character. I think that honestly would have been something cool to see. And overall, when it comes to Cinder, again, out of all the villains that we've gotten when it comes to Dragon's Rising, he is by far my least favorite out of all of them. After this, we then have Noct, and I'm gonna put Noct in B tier. I honestly think that Noct overall is a pretty solid character when it comes to the show. I will admit, during Season 2 Part 1, I didn't think he was all that impressive, but Season 2 Part 2 definitely changed my opinion around, with him bulldozing his way through the competition and him being motivated by his pettiness and his view that everything is war. I think that's something honestly interesting to see. I like the idea that when it comes to Noct, he and Rox were secretly working alongside one another in order to kill multiple Arc Dragons in order to bring back the other members of the Forbidden Five, and they were secretly working against Roz the entire time. I think that's something that was handled really well. His final fight against the Ninja towards the end of Part 2, I think, is something else that was honestly handled really well, and it showed just how strong he really is. And I like that Season 3 Part 1 was able to continue on with a lot of the stuff that we saw with Noct during Season 2 Part 2, especially his dynamic with Roz, with these two really hating each other. I thought that was something that was handled pretty well, and overall when it comes to Noct, he's a character who I do honestly like. After this, we then have Rox, who I'm going to be putting in C tier. Just like with Noct, I will admit that for a while I wasn't really the biggest fan of Rox, primarily because I just didn't really think she was all that interesting throughout the events of Season 2, but Season 3 Part 1 I think was able to do some things with her that I did like, particularly expanding on her character more, with her and Noct being the leaders of the Forbidden Five, and Rox being shown as being fairly sadistic throughout the events of Season 3. I think that was something interesting, showing how it was able to expand on her character. I thought that was nice. Although, for the most part, I just don't really have that much to say about Rox, but overall, I think she's fine when it comes to the show. And finally, we have the other members of the Five, and when it comes to Drix, Kerr, and Zarkt, I am putting them all in D tier. These three honestly all felt pretty underwhelming when it came to the show, primarily because Dragon's Rising has been doing so much build-up when it comes to the Forbidden Five, yet I feel like when it comes to Noct and Rox, these two are really the only ones who have anything interesting as far as their characters and personalities go. Meanwhile, for the other members of the Five, it feels like these three really don't have that much going on. There are some small bits of their character that we see throughout the events of Season 3 Part 1, and we do see some interesting things with their elemental powers, which is kind of cool, but overall, these three just don't really come off as all that interesting or compelling when it comes to the season. They all honestly felt pretty underwhelming considering all the build that we've gotten with them so far. Now, I haven't seen the leaked episodes for Season 3 Part 2 yet, right, so I don't know if the Forbidden Five return during that chapter and if the show ends up doing more stuff with them. Again, that's something I don't know about. But given the stuff that we've gotten with them so far, again, when it comes to these three members of the Five, I'm not really a fan of any of them because, well, again, we've gotten all this build-up, but there really isn't anything that interesting about any of them, really. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. That is my tier list ranking a bunch of Ninjago villains. So tell me down below what you guys think. And tell me, what are your guys' rankings when it comes to the various Ninjago villains? Tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.